Hello, it's Mike Saini speaking. Welcome back to part two. And in this part two, we're going to be talking about screening. We're talking about how to make sense of the various allegations that are coming in, but also just screening generally and in every single situation, because screening is so fundamental to the work of the evaluator. And it's so important that we need to make sure that we understand what we're screening and how are we screening and for what purpose are we screening. And we know that screening tools have been developed for various reasons. And so we're going to spend some time looking at those and trying to make some sense about how to go about ensuring that we're thorough, we're comprehensive, we are being sensitive to the needs of those involved, and that we're not prematurely closing our investigation around violence because we perhaps used the wrong tool or we haven't used ourselves in a way that gains trust. So we're going to talk about trauma-informed ways of screening, because I think these are new areas that I think are worth being, to think about and to see how you can integrate it into the work that you're doing. All right, well, let's go. So again, this is going to be another 1 hour webinar, and the focus will be on screening for safety, recognizing and responding to family violence in custody cases. The abstract for this part two is to focus on screening and to recognize the signs of family violence, including physical injuries, changes in behavior or mood, fearlessness or fearfulness, reluctance to talk about other parent. And then we're going to talk about approaches for assessment and focus specifically on sensitivity and empathy, because we can use tools to help us standardize the process. But we are a tool. It is our engagement, our rapport building. It is our ability to be sensitive and empathetic that allows for people to feel comfortable enough to talk about something as personal as experiencing violence. And so it's important that we're not prematurely checking off the box and saying, no, no violence here, let's move on. We don't want to be excluding violence. We want to be giving weight and space for violence and in all its various forms, to be able to to have space, to be able to be included in our analysis. And we don't want to be excluding it at the very beginning and never looking back, because in those situations we may be missing key information. So the learning objectives will be to understand the importance of screening. We're going to look at some of the current debates around screening tools and some of the ethical considerations. And then we'll talk about implications and best practices for screening and assessing. And I'm also going to bring in some trauma-informed perspectives as well into the screening, so that we have a better idea about when somebody is emotionally dysregulated and perhaps outside of the window of tolerance. And we'll talk about what that means as we go through this. So screening is crucial in parenting plan evaluations. It's in the guidelines. Most guidelines include some aspect of screening, and screening in all cases, not just when you have evidence to suggest that it may be a concern, but you should be screening in all situations because we do know that the risk of violence goes up at the time of separation. We know that people are in a situation of transition, and we want to make sure that people are safe, and that if we're going to recommend a plan, that it's not going to put people in a precarious situation because of our inability to discover violence when violence was there. We want to make sure that safety is paramount, and that the child's both safety and well-being are being considered. So it's important because if we don't screen right away, if we don't screen in terms of even just the process, so there's screening for violence in terms of what the parenting plan is going to look like. There's also screening in terms of what the evaluation is going to look like. Are you going to bring both people together in the same room? Well, not if there's been violence, not if there's restraining orders. You can work around those, but do you want to? Would people feel safe to be in those spaces? And so screening for the evaluation is just as important as screening for the recommendations. And so we want to make sure we understand frequency, pattern, impact, timing, severity. When was the last time? When was, what was going on there? What was how many times it happened before that? We really want to get a good sense of the overall context of the violence. And then one of the biggest questions that you can ask people is, are you afraid of the other person? It's the fear that we also need to tap into. It's not just about previous incidents of violence. It's also about how it's impacted individuals, and part of that is do they have any concern? Do they worry about the other parent? Do they worry about being in close proximity to the other parent? So we want to make sure that again, the parenting plan is safe. We don't want to expose children to plans where they're going to be exposed to potentially further violence. And we see this. We have a project that we did in Canada, in Alberta. Beth Kuhn was a primary researcher on this, and I was involved as a collaborator. And we found that in shared parenting situations, none of the women reported physical violence, but many of them reported other forms of violence. And so are you excluding physical violence, but not considering the impact of other forms of violence? And what impact does that have for children to be in that type of context? What impact does that have for your ability to make recommendations that are going to see, that that they can make a benefit for this family? Or are the recommendations providing opportunities for further harm? So we need to make sure we're creating a safe and supportive plan for children and their parents. And we need to make sure that we're tailoring these plans to account for the past violence, the current violence, and also the potential for future violence. Sometimes it means involving supervised visitation temporarily until all other considerations have been addressed. Now, having said that, and I'll talk more about this when we get into specific types of parenting plans. We don't want to put people in supervised visitation and then just have no plan around what it would look like if they don't have supervised. I have a paper on long-term use of supervised visits, and I think the longest one was 18 years, and to whose benefit? And so we titled the paper "It's part of the plan, but it should not be the only plan." So if that's happening, then what are other people doing so that one day they won't need to have supervised? We also have legal and ethical obligations. We need to be compliant with legal mandates to assess and report family violence. In Canada, again, we recently included family violence in the best interest test. Other places have been much more progressive in including violence as one of the indicators that need to be considered in every case. And so you need to know your legal requirements. You need to know your ethical standards to protect vulnerable individuals. You need to know what the guidelines say. You need to make sure that you are fair and thorough in your evaluations to consider best interest and to consider as part of best interest, what does family violence look like, if anything, for this family? And if it does, then you need to figure out, what type of violence, the frequency, the etiology of the violence, the prevalence, and then, potentially what remedies could be put in place to address the violence. We need to be recognizing those signs of violence, not just from our own observations, but we need to be asking questions about the signs of family violence with collateral sources, with teachers, with coaches, with sometimes it's coworkers. We need to be asking about these signs. There's physical injuries, and those physical injuries would be more likely to receive medical attention. But what about behavioral changes, withdrawal, anxiety, depression, sudden changes in behavior or mood? Those could be indicators of violence. What about fear? Fearful reactions to certain situations. Are they more startled? Are they more jumpy than before? Are they more reluctant to speak about the other parent? So these could be signs of family violence. And what other indicators are there? Absence from work, late to appointments, inconsistent explanations of injuries. Leslie Droz and Bill Austin did this wonderful decision tree for assessing for allegations of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, or what I'm calling family violence, or at least in the relationship realm. So you need to look at risk factors. What are the risk factors of violence? Well, substance misuse is one of them. They're highly correlated. If you see that there's drinking happening, or other substance abuse or misuse that's been reported, then the correlation of family violence is high. So you would want to look at those risk factors. The length of the relationship, the type of relationship that they've had up to that point, whether there's been previous violence or previous other episodes of patterns of violence. Do they get in fight at bars? Do they fight with the neighbors? Are there any mental health issues? And then has been any threat factors? So making a threat, stalking, having weapons. And then what type of aggression? So again, this fits really nicely within a family violence framework, an umbrella approach: physical, emotional, sexual, coercive control. And then you look at the frequency, the severity, the active or remote. Is it currently happening? And then what's been the pattern? I mean, sometimes it's easy just to, draw a line and say, okay, when does this happen? Like, so, and then you start drawing the different types of or different incidents, and then you can develop a pattern just by connecting those dots. And then looking at, the type of violence. Was it pattern of instigation? So what has been the pattern of instigation? Primarily male, primarily female, mutual, defensive, or reactive? And then you have the categories of IPV, substance abuse associated, coercive control, inclusive, authoritarian, mental health or mental disorder associated, conflict instigated, and separation associated. And then you're looking at, of course, children's safety and well-being, and then that feeds into a parenting plan. So this is important because even if you're using a standardized tool won't give you all of this context that you need. It may give you the types of violence. If you use, let's say, a tool that gets at coercive control, if it doesn't, it's not going to give you that. It could give you frequency, severity, and any patterns. But without this full context, you may not fully appreciate the extent or the magnitude or the context of the violence. We know that people will minimize. They may feel shameful of the violence. They may want to protect the person who is abusing them. I had one situation where there was lots of documentation of extreme serious violence. And the mother was applying for primary care and for the children to have a minimal relationship. But while this was going on, she was so afraid of him that she went over to his house and cleaned it up and made breakfast. So when I showed up for my observation there, it was cleaner than the first time I was there. And it looked like he had made breakfast. But I asked the question, oh, wow, this is cleaner than last time. And breakfast. And he said, yeah, well, she came over and helped. And not having a good understanding of violence, it would be too easy to suggest that she's just minimizing the extent of the violence, or she's minimized, or she's fabricating, or she's not saying the truth about the violence. But in fact, it was because of that disorganized behavior that on one hand I'm trying to protect my children, on the other hand I'm making him look good for the children. That fearful, disorganized response suggested to me just how much turmoil was within this situation. We know that people who have experienced violence can have disorganized attachments around the violence, which means they're fearful. And so they do things that may not look organized, and it may get at their credibility. But we need to understand and differentiate, is this related to the unresolved trauma that's occurring because of the violence, or is this a credibility issue? And we don't necessarily always do a good job of making that differentiation. So it's also difficult to obtain accurate information. I mean, I mean, it's difficult either way. And on one hand, I had a mom who recorded everything like 6 months until separation, and she was being accused of fabricating a case against the other side because she was documenting and going to the police and going to um, the her physician. But on the other hand, I've had people who have disclosed violence but don't have any record of it because they've been too ashamed to go get help. Um, and so when we do these evaluations, we're not going to have perfect information all the time. And so we are often needing to make sense of of different pieces of information, which is why triangulating the evidence is so important. So we need a systematic approach, and the AFCC guidelines provide suggestions about being systematic in the way that we conduct our evaluations. We need to follow a structured method that allows us to identify risk factors and patterns of violence and the implications for parent safety. So these are common ways that we should be doing most evaluations. Specifically when we are considering the impacts of family violence. So first of all, our interviews and observations are so critical. Spending time with individuals, both parents, with the children, with the collateral sources. We're not just quickly going through these, but we're sitting down and we're creating space to have these scaffolding discussions of allowing them to, that trust to be built. So we're asking questions that are not threatening, that allows the narratives to come out. And we're doing so in a forensic way, but also in a sensitive way. And so there's there's an integration of a therapeutic approach within a forensic framework that I think is really important. Our observations, we're looking at this. I don't do the observations until I've done the interviews with the parents and the children, and I have a good sense of the collateral sources, because then I can triangulate my observations of their interactions with that information. I'm looking at consistency. I'm looking at proximity. I'm looking at whether these are familiar interactions or whether they seem staged. Um, and so you're using those observations. We have an article on the ecological validity of home observation or observation visits, not necessarily just home, but sometimes it's at the park, sometimes it's at the office. And making decisions around those, I think, is also really important, because there's research that shows that whether it's done at the office or at home, you end up with different behavioral indicators from children. And so knowing what you're trying to observe and what you're trying to triangulate coming into that observation is an important planning phase. The psychological testing, if you use it, I don't use it. I'm a social worker. I'm not regulated to make diagnosis or use testing of any kind. But I am familiar with the research on testing, and I know some use testing, and you need to be thinking about false positives, so you're not prematurely discounting the potential for violence, because there are problems with false false positive with some of these tests. And then risk assessment tools for assessing for future violence. And I'll go into more details with some of these. The problem with many of these is that they actually don't have good predictive validity. And so it's important to understand that an assessment tool or a screening tool can have good reliability, which means it's getting at the same concepts again and again in the present. But it may not have good predictive validity, which means that it does not predict the reoccurrence of that consideration. So if you don't have good predictive validity of the reoccurrence of violence, then it's really hard to assess for future violence if you don't have a tool that can help you do that. Reviewing records, making sure that you're looking at police and medical and criminal and child protection service records, therapeutic, if that makes sense. And then you'll want to look at the impacts. How has the violence impacted the parent's autonomy, economic resources, mental health, ability to co-parent safely, and then children's emotional behavioral functioning. Most tools that have been developed for violence screen at the adult level. Very few tools actually screen for children's exposure to violence. And so you need to ask questions with children about their experiences. You need to ask parents about, well, where was your child during this? And what did your child observe during this? And what was your child's emotional state during this? You need to start, understanding the impact this has on the children and not just assume that they've been negatively impacted because they were there or because they were exposed. So looking at screening tools, there's a number of screening tools that have been developed. Typically, a two-step approach is recommended. So you do a short tool to identify any red flags. And then if any red flags have been uncovered, then you then go further into a more detailed assessment of the violence. And so, and I've done some work on triage, and we've looked at different tools that allow that two-step approach. But generally speaking, the first step would just be asking whether or not there's any concern with the other parent, whether there's been any incidents of violence in the past. And through those questions, you then can identify red flags and then go further into an assessment if needed. Once you go into screening, you need to be clear about your definitions of violence, as we talked about, and you need to have a good understanding of risk and also safety planning. Because you're tapping into family violence, you should know what resources are in your community to support people who have experienced violence. So where are the shelter homes? Do they know how to access them? Who do they turn to support? Who are in the community who can provide them support? Do you have their names? Do you have their contact information? Can you provide a safety plan or at least guide them to the appropriate resources to help build that safety planning? It's a critical piece. We don't want to just say, yes, there's been violence, but I'm doing a forensic evaluation. And therefore, whether you're unsafe or not, I can't jeopardize my evaluation. If there are safety concerns that need to be addressed, we do have a duty to report child protection issues, and we also should be thinking about safety planning when there's an immediate risk to one of the parties. We need to be thinking about cultural specific ways of assessing, specifically for Indigenous individuals or newcomers or older individuals or people with special needs. We need to be thinking about different forms of violence, from a cultural sensitive perspective. And we need to be trained on all these tools. We need to be able to interpret the results of any tool that we're using, and we need to be able to follow their appropriate actions with our own clinical judgment. So there's many tools that have been used in parenting plan evaluations. Many of these have been borrowed from healthcare, and some from mediation. And so it's important to know which tool you're using and why was it developed and what was it intended to assess, and can it actually do what you're hoping it to do. But here's just a couple: conflict tactic scale, and there's also the revised one, so the conflict tactic scale 2. It's one of the most widely used tools for assessing violence in research. Not a good tool, though, I don't think, for doing parenting plan evaluations. It's complicated to use. I used it for my thesis, and it really goes into detail, and the scoring on it is quite complicated. And although it's research based, it's got good reliability generally across populations. And it's been used in the context of separation and divorce, but not in the context of, can we use this tool for parenting plan evaluations? There's a danger assessment, which is used to determine the level of danger an abused woman has of being killed by her intimate partner. So it gets at not just the presence of violence, but also gets at it's moving into a threat assessment. We also have the domestic violence screen inventory, assesses the risk of future domestic violence offenses. Although it's future orientated and it gets at future risk, it doesn't have good predictive validity. So I'd just be wary of that. You have the spousal assault risk assessment, is used by professionals to assess the risk of spousal assault, and it focuses on the history of violence and psychosocial adjustment and current relationship factors. So it tries to bring in the current history with the past history. Hits, it's quick. There's only, I think, there's 4 key questions: hurt, insult, threat, and screaming. It actually has predictive validity. There's been studies that have shown predictability on this, but it's like 60% accurate. So it's a little better than flipping a coin. So just to keep that in mind. We also have the child abuse potential inventory, and this gets at the risk of child maltreatment, but also can, within a broader understanding of family violence, can help. And then we also have the MASIC short, so the MASIC S. So we have the old MASIC, which is a longer form, and then more recently, they have the streamlined version, and they're continuing to write about it and test it. And it's been mostly used in mediation, but people have used it in the context of parenting plans as well. So the limitations of all of these tools is that most of them focus on certain types of abuse, such as physical abuse. So they don't necessarily tap into and differentiate between situational violence and coercive control, for example. So they mostly have narrow definitions of what constitute risk. There's a failure to screen for coercive control behaviors generally, and a lack of behavioral specific questions. Most of them are not where they were not developed specifically for separated couples, although they've been applied to separated couples, but that's still different. So you need to be able to compare the scores of separated in the context of a parenting plan dispute versus those that are not, and that we just don't have that research oftentimes. There's a failure to address issues of comorbidity, so substance misuse, mental illness, and other factors that I talked about that need to be considered. So it doesn't get at the full complexity as mentioned in Leslie Drosten and Bill Austin's diagram, not being designed for universal screening. And so, I mean, I think that's where you get into, the two-prong approach. Your first could be more universal, where you ask, 4 or 5 questions, and then you would use these tools for more of the assessment piece, but being mindful of what is being missed by being too specific in the tool if it doesn't cover other aspects of family violence. Not screening for both victims and perpetrators, and also not for children. And most of them require intensive training. And so you just usually can't pick up these tools and start using them. You want to make sure that you have the proper training to do them before you actually start using the tools. So in terms of screening for violence, more sources of information, the better. So the screening tools are good, but they should not be the end all be all. Your interviews, your observations, your collateral sources, the reports, your own clinical judgment, all of this plays an important part in an overall assessment of family violence. And so we need to make sure that we're not underestimating perceptions of being impacted by violence. And we know that sometimes lawyers are telling their clients not to disclose violence in fear of counter allegations of alienation. And so people may be reluctant to share experiences of violence. And we need to be mindful of how we go about asking questions around screening. There's different procedures for using screening: private, in person, telephone, written questionnaires, checking with court documents, also online. And there's been some recent research showing that online screening, especially post-pandemic, can be effective at a screening in mediation context. That's from Rossi and Company. It has not been tested in parenting plan evaluations, so we can't make that leap. But I think some precautions would be necessary and needed to do online screening, but it's not impossible. You just need to be there's ways of doing that helps to build the integrity of that type of screen. So ongoing training is critical. Being informed about trauma is so important. Keeping up with the latest research and best practices, knowing which tools are out there, and getting the training as you can for these various tools to figure out which one works for you. There's no gold standard tool that's out there right now. They all have their strengths and they all have their limitations. So when you use one of those tools, you want to make sure you understand the protocols, and you want to be able to look at both past experiences and also look at the future indicators and understand any controlling tactics and any fear of the other party. That private screening, I think, is preferred. You want to make sure that it's confidential in a setting that like your evaluation is not confidential, but you're in a you're not doing it at a Starbucks, for example. Like, other people won't be able to hear you. And that way you're encouraging honest disclosure. Take breaks, let them know like this is going to be challenging. You may have to take a break or two as we go through this, and that's fine. And if you need to just take a moment, let me know, and we'll take a break. We need to be assessing risk factors. And so there's various risk factors that have been suggested in the literature. Here's some here: obsessive, jealous, threatens suicide or self-harm, misuse of drugs or alcohol, threatens, strangulation, attempts, sexual assault, planning to leave or recent separation, controlling behaviors. These are all indicators that you want to be looking out for in your assessment. Doing a screening isn't good enough just to do it once and then put that away. You want to constantly monitor and be vigilant to any changes in behavior, especially when you're involved in an evaluation. Let's say it's for 3 months. That 3 months means that, you know, there could be an escalation of violence during that time because the stress is so high. And so we want to make sure that we are, you know, doing what we need to be doing to ensure that we screen throughout the process. We want to be flexible. It's not a one size fits all. We want to make sure that we're identifying any flags in the beginning, and then we work towards assessing and understanding any allegations and triangulating and going back for additional information if needed. So we have to constantly, you know, we have a structured approach, but we constantly are fluid in the way that we are assessing. And then again, as I mentioned before, we need to consider safety planning when needed, including referrals, ensuring that people are not in imminent risk by asking questions around their feelings of safety. So one way of building trust in this process is to be sensitive and to be empathetic. To build that trust, we create safe environments. We are involved in active listening, and we're trauma informed in our approach. And so it's worth just taking a moment to talk about what is trauma informed. And that is basically creating a safe, supportive environment that prioritizes the well-being of the parents who are involved and the children who are involved in these evaluations. So trauma really could be any emotional response to a terrible adverse event. And it becomes an overwhelming experience where it's a feeling of loss of control. And so the mind and body from that point on doesn't want to go back to that state of loss of control. And so they will be hyper vigilant from that point on to better respond to threats in a hyper vigilant way. So they'll fight, flight, fawn, they will freeze, they will do whatever they need to do to protect themselves so they don't end up in that situation again. And so types of trauma is, again, like family violence, it's not just one type. It could be a natural disaster. It could be, you know, somebody who's come from a different country and that country has experienced war. or a natural disaster. That could be an unresolved trauma, repetitive trauma, chronic child abuse, human atrocities, being a torture of war, or from being a person of war, cultural trauma, intergenerational transmission. So the research shows that if you have a grandparent who has experienced cultural trauma, then that may have been passed on through parenting and such. So then the grandchild who did not have those same trauma experiences do, although experience that intergenerational transmission of trauma. So the effects of trauma, this is where I think is really important for screening for violence, because oftentimes we're looking at folks in terms of their credibility. And when we look at people's credibility, and it's in the context of um, of their ability to give a coherent narrative, well, they may not be able to, because traumatic events renders victims helpless by these overwhelming forces, because they have experienced threats to their body and mind. They're going to be quick to react and quick to protect themselves. They will see threat where no other person may have seen threat. They may disrupt a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And they may confront human beings with extremism and helplessness or terror. So these often are responses that are adaptive to them. They protect themselves. So the maladaptive behavior sometimes that we address in parenting plan evaluations could simply just be normal responses to abnormal events. And we are too quick at times to label without fully appreciating why these experiences are occurring or why these responses are occurring. So anxiety and depression, substance misuse, anger, aggression, these could be normal responses to terrible events. And we need to be quick to be comprehensive rather than quick to judge. So those who have been traumatized or experiencing unresolved trauma may experience events by reenacting those past traumas and feel unsafe or unable to deal with their feelings of fear, and therefore become activated by the events. So you may be trying to screen around violence, which then activates them and puts them back into a spot where they feel activated and therefore shut down or unable to process. So when we're screening in the context of parenting plan evaluations or in the context of any work that we do, mediation, parenting coordination, whatever it may be, we really want to strive for this window of tolerance. This window of tolerance is when you're able to think clearly because your prefrontal cortex is engaged and your amygdala has been soothed. And so you're not hyper aroused or you're not hypo aroused. If you're either hyper aroused or hypo aroused, you are then activated by your potentially your unresolved trauma. And you're not able to think clearly through And what happens then is that they're hyper aroused or hyper aroused. And then we use that information to assess their credibility. And they're not perceiving to be credible because when they're hyper aroused, they're agitated. When they're hyper aroused, they're shut down. They look like they're disconnected. And so we need to be really clear that we're not creating unsafe conditions in the way that we set up our evaluations so that they feel, they feel unable to participate. And unsafe does not mean, again, physical. It means that if we're not addressing the feelings of safety within the process. So if they feel that they're being activated or triggered, and the evaluator is not changing the tempo, not changing the type of questions, not changing how they're going about doing the evaluation, it could make them feel unsafe. And then they would either shut down or become agitated. And if they become agitated, then it becomes, unfortunately, further evidence for the evaluator that the person is not engaged in the process. And so they get further victimized by the evaluation process when somebody does not look at this from a trauma-informed perspective. So how do you know when somebody's activated or triggered? Well, they change positions or stories, and they forget key details. They'll not speak in a linear way, and they'll lack coherence in their narrative. When you talk to people who are involved in high conflict, the research shows that many of these folks have fearful attachment styles. That was part of my dissertation. And so it should be no wonder that we are seeing these types of activations that look like fearful attachment or a trauma activation. So they may be agitated or hard to take in new information. Unfortunately, at the same time, we are assessing their credibility, and we're also, assessing their parenting and their parent functioning. And so they don't look good as parents if they're activated. And if we don't help them get within the window of tolerance during the time that we spend with them, as we're going through and digging up this really hard information, then we may be, exacerbating these activations, which then further makes them seem less credible. So we need to find ways to assess in a sensitive way, in a empathetic way, in a trauma-informed way. And then once we have that information, we need to think about how to use this for our recommendations. And so we don't want, just like we don't want to activate people in the evaluation process, we don't want to create parenting plans that are going to have folks activated. So what does that mean? Well, Bruce Smythe from Australia is doing some great work around the transitions or the exchanges between homes. And so if there's violence, you probably want to limit the amount of exposure, the amount of exchanges. It may be the use of supervised parenting time. It may be limiting decision making. You need to think about not only what's going to keep people physically safe, but what's going to keep people emotionally, psychologically safe. And oftentimes I find that we don't have discussions about psychological safety and parenting plans, which I think are so critical. Jan Johnson's work on the guiding principles of complex cases. You set priorities. Number one is you protect the child. Number two is you protect the safety and the support and well-being of the so-called victim parent. Third, you respect the rights of adult victims to direct their own lives. Four, you hold perpetrators of domestic violence accountable for their abusive behavior. And then five, if all allow child access to both parents, you begin with the goal of achieving all five, but you resolve conflict by abandoning the lower priorities. And so the idea here is that yes, both parents are important in the lives of children, but safety must be paramount, and protecting children must be paramount. And Peter Jaffe and company they've recently updated their parenting arrangement after violence. And again, as there's more high risk of future violence, then you look at limiting the pattern of interaction, but also the both the parents and the child as well. So summary of key points for this webinar. One, screening for violence is crucial in parenting plan evaluations. It should always be done. We need to understand the signs of family violence and by observing not just physical injuries, but also behavioral changes, fearfulness, and reluctance to discuss the other parent. Victims may be minimized or deny abuse to fear shame. And so we need to be mindful not to prematurely close our assessments, our screening, because people don't disclose. They may not disclose right away. You may find that you need to triangulate this with other information and then come back to it in a trauma-informed way. And all of this must be done with sensitivity and empathy. And yes, forensic evaluation is critical. Making sure a standardized or standard approach, a systematic approach is being used is so important. But we can still be forensic evaluators and be sensitive and empathetic. We're not saying we're going to be doing therapy. We're not advocating for one side. We're advocating for safety. We're advocating for a process that is sensitive and that is empathetic. So how to create sensitivity and empathy? Well, we create a safe and supportive environment for clients. When we do evaluations, we are mindful of our space, our office, how we interact with the clients, how we address issues. We use trauma-informed practices to minimize re-traumatization, and we build trust through active listening and validation of experiences. And I think these can help with building better rapport with people. At the end of the day, they may not agree with what we recommend, but they should still at least understand the process, the method that we used, and that be convinced that we did a thorough assessment and that we are judicious in our approach, even though at the end of the day, they may not still agree with what we're recommending. So that is webinar 2 on screening. I hope you found this one helpful. The next webinar will be on the impact of children and parenting in terms of family violence. And that will be our last session of the 3. And I've enjoyed putting this together for you, and I hope that you've found this useful. And again, you can email me and let me know, give me your feedback. I'd be happy to hear from you. Until the next one, thank you and have a good day.